To our breaking news this hour, the US state of Maine has removed former US President Donald Trump from their primary ballot in the 2024 election. Well, joining me live now from the United States is our Sky News US analyst, Michael Ware. Michael, thanks so much for joining us at late notice. What's your reaction to the Maine decision?
It's surprising and it's not surprising. This is actually an issue in at least 24 states. Does former President Trump qualify for an election to public office when some states consider, under the 14th Amendment's third section, that he engaged in insurrection or supported those who engaged in insurrection? Now, Maine is a quirk. Under their state law, you don't have to go to the courts to get someone excluded from the ballot. Voters can petition the Secretary of State, or what back home we would call that, say, an Attorney General. Now, and that's what happened in Maine. A group of voters went to the Secretary of State and said this man was engaged in insurrection and shouldn't be allowed on the ballot. Now, the Secretary of State in Maine happens to be a Democrat. And Shenna Bellows has decided that former President Trump is not qualified to run for public office because he betrayed the oath of office he took when he became president. Look, you can easily see this as a partisan decision because it's a very arbitrary move from someone from the other party. But there are, like I said, dozens of states that have this very issue moving through the courts. So what this really, truly highlights is that this is the SCOTUS presidential election, the Supreme Court of the United States presidential election. There are a number of issues the Supreme Court is going to be forced to decide before the election. Meanwhile, President Trump's legal team are trying to delay so that the Supreme Court does not get that chance before November. But this is a much broader issue than Maine. Absolutely. And that's a very Trumpian legal strategy. He did that when he was in the corporate world. He's done that in the political world. Maine, it has to be said, is out there on its own because this does not require the courts. But already we're seeing Colorado, where the Supreme Court in Colorado said that former president had engaged in insurrection and so therefore couldn't be on the ballot. And that decision is already being appealed by the Republican Party in Colorado. But we also know that they've also kicked that ball down the road, that can down the road in Colorado, because they said, look, we'll suspend this decision to exclude former President Trump until the general election. Look, there's several key issues that have to go to the highest court in the land before this election campaign, and President Trump's only interest is making sure those issues don't go before the bench.
Michael, I want to bring to our viewers, we were talking there about the Secretary of State in Maine, Democrat, as you point out, Shenna Bellows. This is part of how she's come to the decision. This is her quote. She says, "I don't reach this conclusion lightly." She says, "Democracy is sacred. I'm mindful that no Secretary of State has ever deprived a presidential candidate of ballot access based on Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. I'm also mindful, however, that no presidential candidate has ever before engaged in insurrection." Now, this decision can be appealed to a state court, and you can imagine Trump's team will be doing everything they can in terms of the legal avenues. But talk to us about the impact of Maine as a state. Ultimately, it doesn't have that many electoral votes, does it? It's one of those, you could hardly say, the reddest of red states in America, is it?
No, it's not. It's a small state. It doesn't have that many electoral college votes. I don't see it being one of the 5 or 6 states that will actually turn this election. But it's the danger of the symbolism and how that may ripple out and how that may energize pro-Trump supporters and anti-Trump activists. So there are broader ramifications. And like I said, you can easily peg this as a partisan decision by a Democratic Secretary of State. But what it does is it, for the second time in about a week or less, it has brought to the fore that there are serious legal issues hanging over and threatening to drown former President Trump's nomination, even for the GOP primary, let alone the general election.
I was going to say, do you think this actually has any impact on that Trump base? As we head into the Iowa caucuses, we're about 18 days or so away from the first of those, the first votes being cast in these primary caucus situation we see in America. It's so different than our situation here. Does it have an impact on the Trump base, or this is all baked in for them, isn't it?
Yeah, look, the MAGA, Make America Great Again base, the Trump diehards, to say they're rusted on is an understatement. That said, recent polling has shown that there is a certain percentage within even the MAGA base that says if he's a convicted felon, he should not get the Republican primary, let alone run for president. And that's one of the other issues that the Supreme Court was asked to consider urgently this week, and they delayed it and they put it off until another day. And that's been brought by Special Counsel Jack Smith. He's essentially a royal commissioner in Australian terms. He has all the powers of a royal commission. And he's investigating the former president. In fact, he's prosecuting the former president for holding secret documents and betraying American high-grade military secrets, and also for the former president's alleged role in the insurrection on January 6th. Now, that special counsel went to the Supreme Court and said, well, we're proceeding. We know he's going to plead that as president, he had a special qualified privilege, that any act he took in office is protected. Could you please answer that for us now? Because we know it's going to come up. And the Supreme Court refused to take that up at this stage. And I can guarantee you, in all these legal travails, President Trump's legal team is going to wait for the very last day to appeal so that they can drag out the calendar as much as they humanly can.
Because we could find ourselves in almost unprecedented territory here. If he ends up winning the nomination through the Republican process, and then for somehow the Supreme Court decides he's not valid to be on the ticket, where does that leave us?
Well, that's uncharted waters. We're already in uncharted waters. America has never seen a situation like this. A presidential nominee, the likely candidate, the candidate designate, has been charged as a felon. Not once, not twice, but 3 or 4 times. Can you imagine in Australia if somebody wanted to run for Prime Minister, had been charged with an indictable offence and still said, look, I might get convicted before Election Day, but let's carry on with the campaign? That's what's happening here.
It almost feels, though, like we've been around Trump and around the madness that happens in the Trump world, to put it lightly, for years now, that some of this loses its impact. As you say, if this thing were to happen in Australia to a politician here ahead of an election, it would be an absolute bombshell. But for Trump, it just seems like, oh, it's another day in Trump land.
Yeah, in Australia, in a normal universe, electoral universe, former President Trump will be a dead duck in the water, but he's not, because he is Donald Trump. They call him the Teflon man. I mean, he said, as you remember, way before he became president, when he was campaigning, I could take a gun and shoot it down, a street in Manhattan and kill someone, and I would still get elected. And that's proving true. So his mega base will never move from him. What he needs to worry about, whether is issues like this, not to mention just the felony, whether issues like this shuttle any part of his support and his base to another candidate, like former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, who is the momentum candidate. She's still way behind President Trump, but right now the mojo's with her amongst the also-ran.
Yeah, and that has to be the key, whether this does start to have a corrosive impact on that middle of America that ultimately decide elections at the end of the day. If he gets to be in this contest against Joe Biden, as we expect, that does this peel away some of those suburban women, for example, which we know are critical in key swing states. Does this start to play on their mind as to whether they can vote for Trump again?
Well, you took the words out of my mouth. Suburban women. That's where President Trump lost the last presidential election. It's educated suburban women. They don't like his tone. They don't like his tenor. They don't like his policies. And let's not forget what will be an incredibly agitating issue in this presidential election will be the right to life. Pro-choice or right to life. Simply put, abortion. It is a Supreme Court supermajority that was stacked by the former president. If you remember, even in the dying days of his presidency, in the last weeks, he shoved through another nominee onto the Supreme Court bench, and they overturned women's right to choose an abortion or not. That will also be very energizing. So this is the last thing former President Trump needs. But I can assure you that his campaign will be rallying to use it as a plus to drive fundraising.
Oh, they certainly will.
And to drive further support. Absolutely. It's like his mugshot. There has never been a former president in the history of this nation who had to stand in a prison and have his mugshot taken, and then went off and made tens of millions of dollars off it.
Yeah, and within minutes it was on T-shirts, on coffee mugs. It's just a fascinating time in US politics. Michael Ware, thanks so much for getting up last minute for us on that big breaking news.